Welcome to the build video of Pale Relinquent, a generative sound and light sculpture featuring 2 analog and 3 digital synthesizer voices. If you already want to know what it looks like, feel free to skip right to the end where you will find a showcase reel of the finished work. The audio used throughout this video is tapped directly from the stereo line output at the back of the sculpture and is largely unedited. The central element in this project is the interaction between sound and light, along with a handful of continuously evolving rhythmical and melodic sequencers which act as the driving force behind the generative aspect of this work. I will, of course, go more into the details of all of this as the video progresses. The concept of this sculpture was to embody an immutable bleakness, a structure persisting in a void of its own making, yet paradoxically infused with an intangible glow of no discernible source. From a design perspective, the sculpture is separated into 3 sections which, when compared, explore juxtapositions such as analog and digital, illuminance and occlusion, and intricacy and simplicity. At the same time, there is a necessary interplay between sound and light, each acknowledging and accentuating the other's presence within the environment. On a more practical level, I had to revert to the old method of using a table saw and drill press to create the base plate for this piece, a procedure that involves using printed out sheets with drill instructions taped to the surface in question. It's not a formula for precision, but it gets the job done. As mentioned in the intro, Pale Relinquent is a hybrid synthesizer circuit with a total of 5 voices, 2 of which are analog and 3 that are digital. The analog section consists of 2 AS3340 square wave oscillators, a 3360 dual voltage controlled amplifier, and a 3320 -24 decibel per octave low pass filter. This isn't a traditional pair of synthesizer voices. Both oscillators share the same filter but receive an entirely different pitch and amplitude control voltage, and perhaps in a soundscape comprised of 5 different voices, the amplitude becomes the most important parameter. Also, when 2 oscillators are mixed into a filter at the exact right resonance, it tends to gently distort and create subtle subharmonic frequencies which, at least to my ears, can be quite pleasant. There's an example of this happening in the very first segment of this video, where there's a pulsating, almost ring-modulated sound hidden beneath the primary pitches. The remaining digital voices are monolithic sawtooth oscillators with their own VCAs and filters, and are produced by what safely can be considered the heart of this sculpture, namely the Daisy Seed microcontroller. I can't really overstate its contribution to the soundscape. Not only does it execute the algorithmic composition, but it also parses the output of the analog section and contrives the remaining digital voices by derivation of harmonic relationships between the already existing voices. But perhaps the singularly most important contributing factor to the character of the sound as a whole is the stereo delay. It's loosely modeled on the famous RE201 space echo, and I have deliberately introduced pitch variations on the delay line, which is important because since I'm only using a single oscillator per voice, the shimmering effect produced by two slightly detuned oscillators in close proximity is absent. So by detuning the delay instead, I'm essentially getting the same effect with half the number of oscillators. As for the composition itself, it is essentially constructed by two non-synchronized multi-layered streams of data. Each stream consists of two evolving sequencers with rhythm and pitch information pertaining to the analog voices, and this information determines the pitch and entry points of the auxiliary digital voices. You could possibly describe it as real-time harmonization of two independent melodies playing at the same time, where the choice of harmony is determined by the proximity to the closest common harmonic note. At each trigger event, which is equal to a Boolean 1 in the binary rhythm array, other parameters such as the envelope for the attack and decay generator randomize the values. There is also a counter that keeps track of how many times a sequence has run, which, in conjunction with the overall amplitude of the analog voices, has the chance of triggering a modality change that affects the harmony of the entire composition. Lastly, probably one of the least talked about challenges with sound sculptures like this is resisting the urge to let the algorithm do absolutely everything it's capable of. You want to find a balance between compositional variation and a consistent character, if that makes sense. Even though you could go from Gregorian chant to Aztec two-step within a minute, it doesn't mean you should. Most of what I've said so far assumes that you have already seen the showcase video of this sculpture, and that's not going to change. But before I continue with this final chapter, I just wanted to say that the schematics and code will be available to my upper tier patrons on my Patreon page, so if you want to use that as a reference for this last stretch of unfiltered technical logorrhea, go check that out. The speaker enclosure houses a single speaker with a matching passive radiator, which perhaps is a bit disappointing considering the stereoscopic nature of the soundscape. The complete experience can, however, be accessed through a stereo line output when connected to an external amplifier. The speaker is driven by a TPA 3110D2, which is situated within the enclosure next to the power regulators. The sculpture takes an 18-volt input, which is used by the amplifier for maximum headroom, while the rest of the circuitry runs on a combination of plus and minus 12 volts for the analog section and 5 volts for the digital section. The slight difference between this and other speaker enclosures I've made is that the acrylic plates all have beveled edges and are fastened with 3D printed corner brackets that are tapped and attached with bolts. While I was hoping to use a 45-degree chamfer bit to cut the beveled edges, I did, after a few experiments, resort to doing 0.1mm step downs with a standard single flute end mill. In any case, the result, of course, is that you get an ostensibly perfectly fused joint where the edges of the acrylic meet, with no visible cutting marks. Due to the imprecision in the base plate caused by the drill press and printed instructions method, assembling this sculpture was an unusually frustrating experience. I had to go back and forth between the basement and workshop to practically use the drill press as a manual milling machine so that I could selectively enlarge the holes in specific directions as needed. If you remember the video I published about a year ago, I used an external company to laser cut the base plate for me, and at this stage I was very, very tempted to do so again. Next to the speaker enclosure there is another enclosure, or more precisely a diffuser. This is where the digital circuitry is located, including the LEDs, and it's made out of 4mm white opaline acrylic and at approximately 30% translucency. To keep the speaker enclosure relatively sealed, there's a cable gland that connects the two sections, allowing wires to pass through. I tried to keep the cables as loose and plentiful as possible in the hope that the light would appear somewhat sinuous and vascular, or perhaps slightly Lovecraftian. The red power LEDs, which are tied to the amplitude of the synthesizer voices, are controlled by pulse width modulation from the DAISY, buffered by a ULN 2003 Darlington array. The white LEDs, which are tempo matched to the sequencers, are driven by the somewhat more old-school CD4017 decade counter. There are 40 white LEDs, so I'm using 2 of these chips for 20 outputs in total, and scramble the order to make it look more complex than it actually is. To produce control voltage for the analog section, I'm using 2 of the DAISY's internal digital to analog converters, as well as 3 dual output MCP 4822s to control pitch, pulse width, amplitude, cutoff frequency, and resonance. And just like that, we are done. Thanks for watching, and the showcase video of the finished work will be on in a second.